Hello, welcome to AR on AR. I'm Adam Rose, and today I'm going to be looking at the recent Godzone adventure race that took place in Rotorua, and just will share some of the insights that I gleaned from that race. It's a really useful exercise to study how other teams strategized, what techniques they employed, and learn from other people's mistakes and or wisdom so that you can improve your own game, especially if you're a novice adventure racer. The first thing I'm going to focus on is teamwork. It's probably one of the most critical factors in the success of the top teams, and certainly with Team Avaya standing on top of the podium, I would say it's instrumental in them winning. Now, a lot of people look at Avaya. They are the winningest team ever in adventure racing history. You know, there are obviously, there's not simply one reason as to why they always top the podium. And they had won Godzone more than any other team. So going into the race, they were certainly the odds-on favorite to take the win. But adventure races aren't a given. You know, there's no such thing as a perfect race, you could argue. And just in terms of maybe the top three components in their victory, I would say teamwork is right up there. So Avaya, between the four of them, you know, they've got so much experience under their belts. But they know each other so well. So it's not simply about experience of adventure racing, it's about knowing your respective teammates. So knowing what your other teammates need, knowing what to look out for, what strengths, what weaknesses your fellow teammates have. And Avaya is able to capitalize on those things, and that leads to incredible efficiency. The teamwork leads to the efficiency. It's not the only factor in efficiency. But it means, you know, pretty much, you know, the perfect butler is a butler that walks up and gives you that drink before you think of it. Just as you go, the butler arrives with the drink. They anticipate. That's what a perfect butler is. Somebody who can anticipate what the person they're working for needs. So likewise, in Avaya, not having ever met them in person, you know, you can imagine that the teammates know exactly what the other teammate needs before that teammate even mentions it. Okay, and that leads to so many benefits. So certainly Avaya is able to have a very well-oiled machine because of how well they work together and how little energy they waste, basically, in moving forward through their race. Now, that's not to say they're superhuman. They may look like it on the outside, but Nathan gave his captain's report. I'll put a link down in the description below. And he mentioned all the things that went wrong during the race. So from the outside, it might have seemed that they were perfect. You know, the incredible machine, being able to win so far ahead of everybody else. But they had a fair few problems, including bike crashes and sickness and forgetting gear. So nonetheless, they were still able to thrash pretty much everybody else in taking first place, and by how much they took first place. So teamwork, brilliant. Avaya is the best team in the world to look at if you want to look at incredible teamwork. Okay, the second example of great teamwork, I would say, is Team Vertigoats. You might have seen the story. They were on a bike stage, long way to go, and Jamie, who's the navigator, had a problem with his bike. The free wheel seized, so literally the wheel wouldn't turn. They couldn't leave the bike behind. They couldn't just scrap it there. They had to take it with them to the transition. They didn't have the equipment to fix it. They couldn't borrow or get any gear from anywhere else, and no shop out there in the middle of nowhere, I suppose. So they had to take the bike to the next transition. And Nigel stepped up, gave his bike to Jamie, and he ran the rest of that stage. And the three remaining members on bikes carried separate pieces of the bike. And Nigel running 35 kilometers when he certainly didn't expect that at the beginning of the stage. So there you've got a teammate looking out for other teammates, taking their burden. It wasn't that Jamie had to run that whole way. Nigel stepped forward and said, no, take my bike, I'll do it. I'll run, I'll take the burden. So that kind of cooperation, that kind of sacrifice for another teammate, brilliant. It was incredible inspirational images, and you can see that by just by the popularity of the post that Godzone put on their Facebook page, just how many people were impressed by that example of taking it for the team. The third thing I want to look at is team isport. So what was interesting about that team is that you had 4 teammates who had never raced together before, and yet they illustrated incredible teamwork. So it was Richie McCaw's team, just in case you're curious. So leading up to the race, they had a great team, looked very strong, looked like likely to give Avaya a run for their money. But then shortly before the event, people had to pull out, team members, due to injury, damaged wrist. One of the teammates wasn't able to attend because of the lockdown in Auckland, couldn't leave. And so what you had was 4 people on the start line who had never raced together before. So they didn't have the experience of knowing how well each other would compete, what to look out for in terms of strengths and weaknesses. And yet they were able to pull off second place against the number 1 team in the world. So not too shabby at all. And beat a lot of other teams who were very highly experienced, really tough competitors. So what you have there is an example of 4 teammates who, obviously strong personalities, able to push themselves really hard, a lot of strength there, physical strength, mental strength. And sometimes you can have people like that in a team, but unless there's proper teamwork, unless they mesh together as a unit, those strong personalities or those great qualities can actually work against the team. Does the team all have the same priority? Do they know how to, let go of the ego and make those sacrifices or show grace to each other or work together? And certainly they did. So I would even argue that isport's accomplishment of coming second was more remarkable than that of Avaya taking the top position on the podium. It's one thing you race with people you know what to look out for, when to step up. And here you had 4 people who didn't know that and yet were able to perform at the highest level. So really brilliant example of teamwork, enabling them to pull off second place against very, very tough competition. Another takeaway from this race is the importance of strategy. That would have been fundamental in the positions that the top teams took. In this race, you had a mandatory stop, a 6-hour stop at transition 2. And you also had a dark zone when it came to the Mahaka River in stage 6. So, a good idea is to do exactly that. Look at those dark zones, those mandatory stops, and work out when you have to be there, and then work backwards from there. As you can see in this picture, all the lead teams caught up to each other at that dark zone, and there was no way any of them could beat it. So, of course, there was no point in pushing too hard in those first 2 stages. Because there's no point in going out all guns blazing, which is very common amongst even experienced teams in an expedition race. That adrenaline can take over, you can get off the start line at a huge speed, even though you've got multiple days ahead of you. Director Warren Bates even said in an interview pre-race that it looks like sometimes teams are going out for a 9-minute sprint rather than a 9-day expedition. So, Avaya again demonstrated a wise strategy there. They were in the 4th wave of 4 waves. So you might think, as soon as off the start line, they'd be champing at the bit to make up lost ground, catch up with the teams at the very front. But instead, knowing that they were going to have a 6-hour and 4th stop at transition 2, they took it easy. And actually, it's surprising for them to discover that they were moving through the pack regardless. And then they got into the pack raft, and without pushing themselves hard, still found themselves at the front of the pack because they're great paddlers. So they didn't overdo it, they didn't burn the engines too hot, and they got into that mandatory stop at transition 2, were able to have a great 6-hour recuperation, and because they got in first, were able to leave first the following morning ahead of everybody else. And in fact, that was the last time they saw any other teams before the next 4.5 days. So they played it wisely there. And then secondly, with Mahaka River, looking at what time the dark zone was going to be enforced would have been really fundamental in their strategy of what time they should get to the Mahaka River. So that would have pressured them to push hard in order to make that dark zone, get ahead of it, get down the Mahaka River, and thereby put themselves well ahead of any other team that was caught by the dark zone. And in fact, that's exactly what happened. So all the pursuing teams had to stop for the dark zone, and Avaya, being ahead of it, could just continue at their own pace, knowing that they had this buffer. So even if your race doesn't have dark zones, because obviously not all expedition races do, you can still think in terms of cutoff times. So it's not so much going to affect the front teams, but certainly if you're mid-pack or rear pack, you're going to be strategizing based on your speed and what those cutoffs are. And surely every team that enters a race wants to make all the cutoffs so that they can continue on the full course and not be short-coursed. And in fact, in this race we saw, as you would always see, a number of teams caught by the cutoffs, for whatever reason, just basically weren't moving fast enough, and so they're forced to shorten their race. So it's really important to look at those timings. Those timings should dictate what speed you're making, and it might be that because you've got a dark zone coming up or an enforced stop, that you can afford to push harder for a short period rather than taking a premature break only to arrive at the dark zone and have to wait anyway. Look at those dark zones, look at those cutoffs, work from there backwards, and then strategize how fast you should be going. We even saw a team at one of the transitions walk into the transition knowing they're right up against the cutoff, and so they just grabbed all their kits and walked out of transition and across a tarmac road and sat down outside the transition. And they hadn't even got the shoes on, some of them. So they still had to transition in the real sense, get all their kit organized, get the shoes on, get the food organized. But by doing it outside transition, they had left transition before the cutoff. Whereas any team that came into transition and was busy doing everything in transition was cut off because they were still there when that cutoff hit. So sometimes just a simple thing like that can make all the difference between, two teams literally 20, 30 meters physically apart. One across the road, one in the transition. The team across the road is allowed to continue. The team sitting in the transition itself, that's the end of the stage. You've got to take a shortcut and skip out the stages that are coming up. So, pays to be wise. And with those sleep strategies, other things to consider would be the difficulty of this stage. So on stage 4, the row gain, which is obviously very tricky orienteering, you might have found if you're going through that stage at night and it became very tricky, it might have been a good time to just say, look, there's no point in pushing against this, wasting all the energy. Let's just pull over to the trail, take a kip, rest a few hours, and then with daylight you'd make better progress. And then also again on stage 7, untracked wilderness, no paths, no roads to follow. Might be a good idea when the going gets really tough or the weather turns really bad. Okay, strategy, just better to take a sleep, get better energy and move faster despite the sleep than you would with just pushing against that sleep envelope. Sleep monsters, meaning you slow right down and are not moving across the ground as fast as you could otherwise. So sleep strategy is a really critical part of the tools in your toolbox as to how well you're going to perform and how you can outcompete against other teams. Okay, the next takeaway would be with stage 7, across those mountain ranges, which was untracked wilderness. Now, a good idea is to develop navigational technique where you don't rely on man-made features, on roads, on trail junctions, on buildings, all sorts of things like that, because first of all, they're not reliable. The maps that you get might not reflect the true state or the current state of the road trails, of the paths and all sorts of other things. And especially if there have been forestry operations in an area, you look at the map, it shows you certain trails. The forestry operations, usually will tear up the ground, put new roads and paths all over the place. And you come there with your map and it doesn't make any sense. So you should practice recognizing land features which aren't going to change. So ridge lines, rivers, rocky outcrops, all those kind of things. They're not going to change for decades, centuries. So practice navigating based on the stuff that never changes and will be reliable across the maps. Another thing to consider in terms of navigation is trust your navigation, trust your compass. It's quite common for teams, especially at the beginning of a race, when everybody's in a rush to get off that start line and make ground and get ahead, to follow the footsteps of other teams. And even the best teams can make these kinds of mistakes. So you can see here on stage 2, which was the pack rafting trekking section, a bunch of teams all made a similar mistake at CP8, And these teams did it at the same time. They're all there together. So no doubt people at the back assumed the people up ahead knew what they were doing and just followed on behind them. Don't do that. Make decisions for yourself. And this won't only happen on expedition races. You'll find this on a short little 1 hour orienteering race down at the local park. It'll happen anywhere, anytime. So keep your wits about you and trust the technique that you've practiced before the race, rather than trusting other people who you don't know what they're going through. You don't know really what their navigational skills are like. Unless maybe it's Chris Vaughan. Okay, maybe I'd follow him. Okay, another takeaway from this race, I would say, is never give up. What I mean by that is not the conventional, don't give in, continue racing. What I'm talking about is don't expect, just because you're further behind, that you don't have a chance of beating somebody up ahead of you. So, as a specific example, coming off stage 6 and stage 7 off those mountains onto the mountain bike leg and then onto that big paddle across Lake Taupo, it would have been easy to assume that Avaya was going to win. Now, we know they won, but that's not the point. An experienced racer looking at the lead that Avaya had would have said it's likely that Avaya is going to win, but not necessarily the case that they're going to win. So, what could have happened to cause problems with their race? What if Avaya had broken a bike, wouldn't have been able to pedal? What if they had the same problem that you saw on the Vertigoats? Suddenly reduced to somebody running instead of biking? That could have drastically slowed down their momentum. Or on the final pack rafting stage, what if they got a bad puncture? What if they'd ripped up one of their rafts? Fastest time was 3 hours. They could have spent 3 times as long if they damaged one of their boats. So, or a bad accident, somebody could have got injured and they might have been right out of the race completely. In Costa Rica 2013 Adventure Racing World Championships, Seagate, that's who Avaya used to be called, Seagate had to pull out at the end of the second to last stage because their feet were in such a bad state, and the French team overtook them and finally ultimately won the race. So just because a team's ahead of you doesn't mean necessarily that they're going to beat you. Just as an example of this happening, on that pack rafting stage, the team Antiques Roadshow, they were doing the pursuit course, not the pure course, so the shortened version of the Godzone race. Nonetheless, they're competing, I'm sure, and they're up against a number of teams, and they got onto that pack rafting stage well ahead of some other teams. Now, the fastest teams took 3 hours. Antiques Roadshow ended up taking 11 hours, longer than anybody else. And how did that happen? Fairly early on, they made a navigational error, and they went down this tributary or this branch of the lake. Nobody else made this mistake, but they spent 11 hours on there. So, they surely didn't expect that. It looked fairly straightforward from what we saw on the map, just heading a certain kind of northerly direction. And obviously, during that particular paddle stage, Antiques Roadshow, I don't know, something wrong with the compass, didn't know to look at the compass, who knows. Point is, they suddenly found other teams that they were way ahead of had now caught up with them. So it can come down to the wire as to how you're going to cross the finish line. Never give up, never stop pushing. You can, even at Adventure Racing World Championship level, you can pip other teams to the finish line by literally seconds after days and days and days of racing. Okay, so keep on pushing, keep on pushing, keep on pushing. That's what I mean by never give up. And then finally, it's a bit funny really, but a bit embarrassing for the team concerned. But Coromandel Foursquare, they had a little hiccup at the beginning of that final pack raft, which you're talking transition number 10, only 2 stages left. One of the team members, I won't mention the name, found that they had been carrying a 2.5 kilogram weight around in the backpack for the entire event. Before the race started, they hadn't checked their pack to make sure everything in there was part of the race kit. They had left the 2.5 kilogram barbell weight from training. So they literally carried it for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of kilometers up and down those mountain ranges, on those rivers, on those treks, for no reason at all. And I'm sure that person will be living that down for a very long time to come. So check your kit thoroughly before you start a race. Ha ha ha, I'm glad it wasn't me. All right, so hopefully this thing has been kind of useful for you. I'm quite keen, quite up to doing this kind of stuff, post-race analysis. I do it privately, you know, for races. I love studying races. I love watching how teams perform and then picking those important, juicy little bits and say, hey, I'm going to adopt that technique. It's going to work for me. It's going to make my racing better than it was before. Okay. All right. Leave a comment in the comments if you want me to do more of this stuff. All right. See you out there. Cheers.